Hey everyone, how you doing? It's Clara and I'm back with another one of my science chats, and this time I'm chatting with a science communicator, scientist and author, Anna Ploszajski. So it was a really good, interesting talk. It's also a bit of a first because Anna's got a book that's coming out at the time of recording. It's coming out, I think, May 2021. Called what's it called? It's called Handmade, and it's about mixing material science with crafts with personal stories. And so this is a bit of a sort of book interview as well as a get to know Anna. So how exciting! Something a little bit different. And with that, let's just crack into it, shall we? So with that, welcome, Anna. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm doing all right, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. So for our viewers or listeners, who are you? What do you do? What's the elevator pitch?
My name is Anna Ploszajski. I'm a material scientist, writer and storyteller. That's the official line these days.
Storyteller.
So I studied material science at uni, went through the PhD process, did a couple of research jobs after that, and then I made the leap into sort of science communication and science writing. So now I'm my day job is working in-house at the materials department at Imperial College London as a science writer, but I suppose by night I do science communication, public talks, schools talks, stand-up comedy, and popular science writing.
Yeah, a little bit of absolutely everything, and
Pretty much.
soon to be published author.
Soon to be.
That's amazing, isn't it? On top of the thesis and everything else that's been published, of course, but different type of
all those publications that I've got under my belt.
Yeah, I know. I know that one. I know
and
that
a
one.
Small handful of them in the deepest, darkest corners of the academic literature.
I'm trying to write fellowships and it's really difficult. Like my last postdocs were all industrial projects. I couldn't publish anything.
Right, yeah.
And that was a long time ago with a different name in a different country. I'm just making it easy for people.
You couldn't make it more difficult for yourself.
Yeah. There was a certain point where I used to get loads of papers to review and then they just dropped off. And for a couple of years, I'm like, what's going on? Like, people really hate people transitioning. It's like, wait, no, change country, institute, email address, and name. Like, I've not made it easy for people.
You have not. In some ways, though, that can be good, right? Like,
it was a lot of work beforehand. So,
Yeah, exactly.
Things and roundabouts. Yeah. So, let's start. What is your area of expertise? So you did yourself a doctorate and you went through all that. So, and you said it was on material science.
Yeah.
But of course, material science is really huge. And so I might have no clue what you do, or I might have more of a clue of what you do. Who knows? So what was your area? What were you studying?
So I was working in hydrogen storage materials. So I was actually in industry as well. My fourth year master's undergraduate year was working in industry at a little company called Clara Energy in Didcot in Oxfordshire. Good old Didcot. And he had basically discovered this material that contained a lot of hydrogen, which, as we know, is a gas, but this material was a solid material, and it was able to release that hydrogen when the material was heated up to around 120 degrees Celsius. So their grand plan for this material was to be able to use it to power hydrogen fuel cells, with the view to kind of replacing batteries in portable applications like cars or laptops or drones, that sort of stuff.
Wow.
So we're taking a solid material, releasing hydrogen, putting it into a fuel cell and getting electricity. When I started the project, they were basically like, we've got this really cool material, but we don't know how it works. So that was my job, was to work out how it worked. It's actually a composite material out of this stuff called ammonia borane, which is really high in hydrogen, and a plastic called polyethylene oxide. And it was sort of intermingled in some really interesting ways, sort of right down at the atomic scale, but also in sort of larger scales, in more sort of composite type scales. So I was looking at kind of the the physics of how those crystal structures were structured, but then also the engineering of how you actually make a solid state hydrogen powered thing.
Wow. That's really cool. That's really cool. Have you kept up with it since, or is it one of those that it's done and you're like, okay, I'm done now?
Yeah, that one. It was funny actually. At the end of my thesis, I did this sort of like Outlook section, and I drew this little graph of like number of publications with hydrogen storage material in the title, or maybe it was ammonia borane in the title, against time. And it was sort of increasing until 2013 when, until like 2010 when Anna started her PhD, and then it like ran off a cliff and like everybody was just not interested in it anymore. So by the time I finished in 2017, I was like, guys, I've done this really cool thing. And everyone was like, yeah, no, we're doing batteries now. We're not interested in what you've done. So, but then interestingly, hydrogen has sort of made a bit of a resurgence in the last year or two. So maybe it would have been good to stick with it, but that's a long way of saying no. I walked away from the field at that point.
It's always the same with these sort of new technologies, though. I mean, my PhD area, it was, the emerging technology, the technology of the future, and the papers are going up and up and up, and then no one could actually use it. Like, it's all well and good, but if you can't use it, and that's really sort of, you can only get so much funding for blue skies research, and then you need to start being able to use it. And I guess it's probably a similar sort of thing. And I guess it kind of works well for us because we're making a lot of batteries in our lab. So
nice. Yeah, you chose the right field there. Don't do hydrogen.
Well, I'm not doing them, but there's a whole bunch of people that are. And you did, I mean, am I right that you did your undergrad in Oxford?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
It was, and you did materials.
It was material science. Yeah, the nichest of subjects.
I love it. It's interesting because it's such a broad subject, but at the same time it is niche. And so I've been a material scientist for a while, and I've been, this is the first time I've been in a materials department. It's the first time I've been in a university where they have a materials course. It's always, I did engineering, I did electrical engineering. That was my degree, and I came in through the side. So I find it really interesting, and I don't, but I wouldn't. I mean, I didn't know what material science was. It's not something I'd ever gone for. And electronics, yay, I'll do that.
Yeah, well, I'd never heard of the subject. I ended up coming to it in a completely fortuitous and accidental way. I ended up studying material science. Maybe we can talk about that in a bit. But it was. I had never heard of it. Had no idea what it was. But ended up by sort of roundabout way studying it at undergraduate, and just really loved it. Never looked back.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's definitely. I love the interdisciplinary, sort of the way. Oh my goodness, my words are just getting chewed up. But I love how it takes into account all different things, and it's a bit of engineering, a bit of chemistry, and it's just. Yeah, I find it really fascinating, and I love that we're trying to make functional films. We're trying to make functional items, which is really cool.
That's the brilliant thing about it for me, is that it's got the fundamental science of looking at how atoms work, what they're up to, how they interplay, but then there's always a real life application to it at the end of it, and that's what I really love. Yes, you can do fundamental research, but there's always a reason that you're doing it, and it's always kind of a real world application.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool, and it means that there's a lot of industrial collaborations and things like that, and it keeps it interesting. It's a very different way of looking at things, I think. But maybe I've not gone far enough outside of it over the years to really know. And so at the moment you're working in Imperial. So what is it you're doing on a day-to-day? What's your day job? What pays the bills?
What pays the bills is being a in-house science writer. So I essentially prepare kind of written materials for academics. So it's things like applying for funding, grant proposals, writing sort of big funding proposals, writing reports for funders. I have made a website for a research in the lab and in their papers into kind of everyday people's language. So it's very, very varied. I also do some public engagement work in that job as well. So again, trying to translate what these people are doing in the lab into the real world and kind of communicate it in everyday language. And I have to say, I work with a lot of research day to day, and I do not miss research one single little bit.
Oh. So that's interesting.
So it's definitely been a good book. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, you know, the stuff that you're doing is the stuff that I'm like, no, I don't want to do this. And it's the research for me is the interesting part, and I don't want to write it up afterwards. I just want to keep on doing it and seeing what happens. So you're completely the opposite in that regard. I
wouldn't say, sorry, go on.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't say that, you know, writing other people grant proposals is my life's calling.
Yeah.
But I certainly do prefer it to the stresses of leading my own research. For me, my research career kind of run its own course, and I could see where it was going. Right, the path is very well trodden for this. But in order for me to be able to access the next level and to kind of, you know, to really go for a research career would have taken a huge amount of sort of energy and personal sacrifices, all this kind of stuff. And I just, for me personally, wasn't prepared to do that.
No, that's, I mean, it isn't easy in academia. It's not just, hey, I'm good at it and enjoy it, so you carry on. It's so much more than that. And I mean, I've been out of it. You know, I've not been doing it I've not had my own research for sort of 5 years, apart from stuff I've done on the side. And I'm trying to restart it. And it's a lot of reading, a lot of writing, and a lot of disappointment, because you put out proposals and you don't get them. You put out fellowship, and it's just so competitive and it's so brutal. And everything takes so long. You know, you're waiting a year to you start writing something and you submit it, and then you wait a year to find out whether you're going to be able to pay your bills in 12 months.
I know.
It's you know, we need people to be able to do it, but the climate's not great.
No, it's not, and it's quite a hostile field in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really quite harsh expectations, I think, on researchers, you know, to move around the world for a 2-year contract, and then you're not guaranteed to be able to stay. You know, it's not very compatible with, I think, a good work-life balance.
I mean, talked about that on here quite a lot, and you know, there are no, I mean, it's not ideal, and that's why I don't want people on here that we're all talking to. It's not all academics, because there's so much more. And I think that, I'll be honest, you know, I mean, I think if you don't do a degree, if you go the apprentice route, that's amazing, that's great. But if you do want to go to do a degree, that's also great. Doing a PhD, I think, is a fantastic thing if you're at that level and you want to. But then I think, you know, I did 4 years of postdocs after that. And I think that to carry on after PhD, you've got to really know where you're going. You've got to be really driven. And because I had all this stuff going on, it wasn't that easy for me. I fell into stuff by luck. If I'm, you know, obviously you work hard and you create your own luck, but positions came up which I could take. And I was in the position where I could just leave the country and move around and see what was out there. But not everyone can, not everyone wants to. And I'm at the point now where I want to settle, you know, I'm literally got plants outside, you know.
You got to stay put for the plants, man.
Got to stay put, yeah. I mean, not that I'm going to be able to afford a house in Oxford anytime soon, but that's something else. So, I mean, like you say, it's not writing grants for other people, and ironic because I've been writing them today. But writing grants for other people might not be the sort of long-term goal, but I guess it's interesting because you'll get into learn about the cutting edge research of all different types of stuff, and you're having to, and especially if you're communicating it to public engagement and comms and stuff, that's really cool.
Yes, and I've come to realize that that's actually the stuff that I really love. I've done bits and bobs of sort of print journalism as well, and that's my favorite thing, is to call up an academic, get them to speak about their research in everyday terms, explain it to me, and then translate that in writing to kind of an everyday audience. That is, I've discovered, one of my favorite things to do. So yeah, that's what I'm going down at the moment, and we'll see where it leads.
That's really cool. And obviously, I think, we need lots of different voices doing science engagement, and, like you say, schools and things like that, and just different approaches, because of course you do stand-up comedy as well. And I mean, tell us a little bit about that. and I should say, so I mean, I know that you talk about it in your book as well. In fact, that's how we're introduced to you in your book, which we'll sort of talk about. But tell us a little bit about your stand-up.
Yeah, so it all started, but as the book starts, the first scene in the book is my first ever stand-up comedy performance, and that came about because I was doing my PhD at UCL and was pretty fed up with the lab that I was working in. I wasn't enjoying the PhD in the same way that I'd enjoyed my master's working in industry. So I was looking for kind of distractions from the lab and to be able to, have a bit of a break. And UCL run these brilliant sort of graduate school courses. There's so many. There's language courses. You can do training in writing skills. There's such a broad range of stuff. But one which caught my eye was an introduction to public engagement. Because it was a really long course, it was over like a number of days. So I was like, brilliant, maximum time out of the lab. And so I went along to this introduction to public engagement course. It was being run by Dr. Steve Cross, who at the time was head of public engagement at UCL. And I am a bit of a teacher's pet, I would say. And in a kind of group learning situation, I think we've all been to these kinds of workshops where everybody is very, very quiet and doesn't really want to participate. And in those types of situations, I definitely side with the teacher, the authority figure in the room. And so I will always be sort of like putting my hand up, giving them a helping hand. If no one's saying anything, I'll be the one to contribute. So that's how these courses went, was me being relatively vocal in these sessions. And then at the end of the day, Steve, who's a good friend of mine now, he came up to me and said, you seem like a bit of a show off. Thank you very much. And he said, do you want to come and try stand-up comedy? And at the time he was running Bright Club and Science Show Off, actually two comedy nights designed to train researchers and academics in comedy skills, stand-up comedy skills, and then invite them to do a 9-minute stand-up comedy set about their research to a non-academic audience, so to a pub audience, to a comedy audience. And because I like to please authority figures and teachers, I said, yeah, sure, that sounds fun. I knew that I was petrified of public speaking at this point, but I said, yeah, I can't say no to this person. So I signed up for it. And a few weeks later, I found myself standing on stage, confronted by an audience of 150 slightly tipsy, expectant people. Wow. And I had to do a 9-minute comedy set about hydrogen storage materials.
Wow.
And I was very petrified. And that's where you meet me in the book, is sitting in the middle of the crowd, like sweating, like fingers shaking, and then going up on stage and saying, hi, my name's Anna and I'm a material scientist. I'm going to tell you about hydrogen storage materials.
It's and I could feel your pain. And also, I mean, I don't think I'd have had the courage to actually sign up in the first place. But, when you sat there in the audience and you're describing that book, I'm like, yeah, I get that. It felt very real.
Oh, good. I'm pleased. I'm pleased it was quite a visceral sort of entry into the action. But it's funny. So I was very, very petrified of public speaking, but I think I knew that was a personal weakness of mine. And I did want to kind overcome that fear and become a bit more confident. And so that was why I signed up. And, you know, that first comedy night went okay. The audience is very, very first time. I think Mae Martin might have been emceeing for some reason. So someone like Mae Martin was emceeing. This was sort of like 6 years ago or something. So before she was huge. But yeah, then I did that night and it went okay. But it intrigued me, I think, is the thing to say about comedy. It's not scientific. You know, people talk about, oh, there's a formula that you can write formulae for jokes. There are patterns in jokes. There is definitely a science to it, but it is so much more of an art than it is a science. And for me, that was very alien, because up until that point, I'd always been studying, you know, the scientific realm. There's always a right answer. You can get 100% in a test, right? But comedy is entirely subjective, and often it's out of your control. You can deliver exactly the same lines in exactly the same order. In one room, you'll set the whole room on fire and everyone will be falling about laughing. In another room, it'll just go down like a lead balloon. So that intrigued me and I didn't understand it. And so I kept going back. I was like, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to understand how this works. So I kept doing it for a few years.
Wow.
Obviously, I haven't done it we're speaking in March 2021. I haven't done it for a while now.
Yeah.
But,
the world.
The world. For me, I've learned so much from doing stand-up in terms of primarily understanding audiences, and thinking of who your audience are, phrasing stuff correctly and cleverly, because, you know, how a joke is phrased, the words in the right order can really, really change how it comes across. All that kind of stuff really, really helped me in my, you know, the presentations that I do, but also as an academic as well. I directly attribute writing my PhD thesis in the way that I did to stand-up comedy and storytelling sort of techniques that I'd learned over the last few years before I wrote my thesis. So there's definite interplay between the two.
No, I find it fascinating, and I think that this is where I'm going to say a lot of lecturers and academics fall down, is that, you know, they go up and they just present their science and it's just, it's dry. And so people don't necessarily engage, students don't necessarily engage. And I think we could be getting a lot more out of sort of students and audiences if we had better skills. I'm not saying that everyone's going to want to do stand-up comedy or whatever, but
nor should they.
Well, you know, I think that stuff like improvisation and stand-up comedy and stuff are really useful. As much as I wouldn't want to do stand-up comedy, when I'm presenting science and doing my talks, you know, I've got jokes scattered throughout. I mean, I'm not gonna not tell jokes. I can barely, I'm not saying they're good, but, you know, I can barely get through a meeting without at least one joke. And often in science crowds, that sort of people just look confused. But it's been interesting because I really noticed this when I was doing so many talks in person, and then obviously because of what happened in 2020, we all went online, and you don't have the feedback anymore. And so I feel like I'm literally just telling a joke as it's a sentence, as it's just a piece of prose. And so my jokes have gone down. Like I
know. Yeah. It's, and of course they have, because so much about comedy and delivering comedically is about connection, and it's about that feedback. And if there's no feedback, you just feel like you're throwing your voice into the void. And what's the point in that?
I really need that feedback. I really need to see, even if it's just a wry smile somewhere. It's funny because I did a TEDx talk a few years ago, and the audience were fantastic, and there was a few jokes in there and people are laughing. But when I watch the video back, you can't hear the audience laughing, so it looks like I'm just laughing to myself.
I'm waiting a really long time before you say the next thing.
Yeah, this is it. And because people were laughing and then somebody else would get it, so it'd carry on. So it's like I'd start going for the next thing and then catch myself laughing.
Oh, no.
And it just sounds weird because it's like I'm just laughing to myself.
Oh, that's cruel. That's really cruel.
Yeah, I think at the end, like, you know, you can hear a bit more of the laughs. But yeah, like people were laughing. I keep on telling people that whenever they watch it, people were laughing. Honestly, I wasn't just laughing to
Yeah.
myself. That's weird. I mean, I do sometimes, but you know, I think we all do that.
We all do
But
that for
no, I
sure.
think when it comes to science communication and lecturing and things like that, having those tools, whether it's like say improvisation, whether it's the
Yeah.
stand up, even like how you put the presentations together. You know, I've been doing quite a lot with animations, not great animations, but and I realize that they're mostly visual, so they're not, you know, not everyone can access them in the same way, but I just think it adds. And also being able to, you know, if the audience is falling asleep, stop talking about that one property of the film and move on to something.
Exactly. And that is what this year has robbed us of, is being able to read the room.
Yeah.
And change tack and improvise with what you're doing. And connect. You know, that's the whole reason that I do all of this stuff, is to be able to connect with
Yeah.
people. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's just not the same.
It's, I mean, on one side, you know, I'm not traveling up and down the country, and that's kind of nice.
Yeah.
But it's not the same. It's not the same. I mean, you know, I'm sure you're the same. We've not stopped doing it, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've thrown, you know, your talents in other ways, and you've been writing. So it's interesting that you're enjoying the writing during the day so much that you thought, well, let's carry on doing this when I get home and start writing a book. And that's exactly what you've done. You've written a book.
Yes.
I've got a sort of prelim, sort of uncorrected proof version in front of me, and it's called Handmade: A Scientist's Search for Meaning Through Making. Yeah. So what brought this about? Why write a book?
Well, the reason I wrote this book was because I had never read a popular science book that was written by somebody like me, by somebody with the sort of voice that I speak with and write with, from someone coming at the subject from the angle that I was coming at it from. You know, the huge majority of popular science books tend to be written by people at the top of their field. You know, they get to professor and then they get a book deal, because of course that's how it works. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Those books are brilliant in their own right. They communicate the science very, very well. But to me, the stories that are in them, if there are any stories in them, were not the types of stories that I related to. So that was my starting point, really, was wanting to include stories about my own life that I hoped my audience would relate to in some way. So, you know, a key difference about me is that I'm not a professor. I'm probably never going to become a professor. I'm relatively young. I'm a woman. And the stories that I tell are from my life. I don't tell stories necessarily about the science. The key thing about this book is that the stories come first and the science is hooked onto those stories. The science itself is never the backbone of the driving narrative. So that was my kind of key assumption, really, was that I assumed that my audience wouldn't care about the science. And it was my job to draw them into the science with stories about other stuff.
That's really cool, and I like that as an approach. And because science is fascinating, and I think that the way we're taught it in schools, people tune out. And how many times, you know, how many things are there that you look into now and you're like, oh, this is really interesting. I hated this in school. And science is the same. You know, there's so much good stuff. I think, I'm not saying everyone is going to love science, but I think there's probably something for everyone. And it's how we tell that, how we get that across.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think when we learn science in school, the key reason that we're doing it is to pass exams, right? And I refuse to believe that science is inherently interesting.
Oh, I feel like we just froze there a little bit.
Yeah.
In fact,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, we
We're
definitely
back.
froze there.
Okay.
It was
Yeah.
like a mic drop. You said, "I refuse to believe that science is inherently interesting," and then just off we go.
Well,
timing.
I'm very happy with that. Let's leave that in the edit because that's exactly what I hoped for. But I do genuinely believe that, like, yes, we can find it interesting, but I actually think it's only interesting because of what we were saying earlier about material science, because of the real world applications that it leads onto, the consequences of that science. And so that was my starting point for writing to my audience, was I'm not going to assume that you guys give a monkeys about this science, and it's my job to draw you in.
That's cool. And I guess, very overviewy, but I mean, did you start was this like a lockdown project, or had you been writing this for ages beforehand? I'm guessing, you don't just write a book, so.
Yeah, what's that meme? The Lord of the Rings meme. One does not simply write a book. So I was writing it for probably a year and a bit, for most of 2019 actually.
Okay.
That was the period, and then for the last couple of months of writing was the first couple of months of lockdown in 2020.
Okay.
So the majority of it came beforehand, which you will realize in the book, because it's all about me going out and about, meeting people and shaking people's hands and having a go at putting my hands in the clay that someone else has put their hands in, which none of these things are allowed to do anymore. So unfortunately the book has become very dated very quickly.
Yeah, how did I not? That was obvious, but yeah, now you've said it, yeah, that makes sense.
But no, it's a good question. And all of those ideas were sort of percolating in my mind for much longer than when I was writing it as well. I started a podcast in 2017 where I started to interview makers and craft people about materials, and that was really the main inspiration for the book, because back in 2017 I came to this sort of epiphany, really, that I'm a material scientist. I can make graphs out of materials. I can write all of the formulae of how these materials' properties relate to each other, and all of that kind of stuff. I can do it all on paper, but actually, I cannot throw a pot on a potter's wheel or forge an iron bar in a blacksmith's forge. I can't do any of that sort of hands-on stuff. Most of the time I can't even identify what objects around me are made out of. I can do it all on paper, but there was this huge kind of gap in my understanding, which I came to realize then. And I realized that the gaps in my understanding really came from the world of craft and art, and the sort of other side of this, like, art science divide. And materials is a really interesting way to bridge that divide, I think, because craftspeople and artists obviously work with materials every day with their hands. They experiment with it. They really get to know it and how it behaves in the real world. And us material scientists do kind of the opposite of that, really. We're very much on the kind of theoretical side, broadly speaking. Obviously, research.
Grow things in perfect conditions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I started having these conversations with craftspeople and artists and just asked them about their materials, what they knew, and learned from them. So after a few years of doing the podcast, I decided to write a book and kind of have a go, like actually get my hands dirty and kind of try all of these craft processes, and write about that.
That's amazing. And is that podcast still going, or?
It is.
Evolved,
it is
right?
still going. It used to be called.
Oh, sorry, lost you again. What was that again?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Where did you lose me from?
You said it's called. It was again another perfect timing thing.
So the podcast used to be called Real Talk.
Yeah.
Which was a pun on material. And then for a few years, I had to explain the name every time I introduced the podcast or spoke about it to anyone. So I realized that was not the best approach. And so then I changed it to, it's now called Handmade, to be in line with the book as well. So it's much easier to describe to people now.
I
Yeah.
did wonder whether the title changed to coincide with that, but that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to. So I'm as much as I put this out as a podcast, I am not a podcasty person. I've never really downloaded them, but it's something I really should do because there's so much stuff I'm missing out on. But
They're great. I really got into them when I was working in my PhD lab and having a really miserable time. I listened to when I wasn't talking to anyone around me, I was just listening to other people in my ears. They were my friends.
See, for me, it was emo and goth. So,
Okay.
I'm that kid. It's funny, you were talking about being teacher's pet before, and you said a lot of people are quiet. I'm not that. I'm the sarcastic kid. Even now, bearing in mind I teach and I do courses and stuff like that, I'm still that miserable goth at the back of like, oh, that's wrong. I'm horrible to teach. I really am. And I know that. And it's weird because I love learning.
Yeah.
Because I want to learn stuff. And yet my brain is just like, no.
Fair enough.
But yeah, no, the book. So I think that it interests me because it actually combines three of my passions. Because it's about science, but then you tie a lot of the chapters into the outdoors. And whether that's swimming, whether that's being in the mountains and stuff like that. And so I mean, I've spent a lot of time. I'm a climber. I'm a hiker. I've been arranging a rough camp, a wild camp. I love the outdoors.
Yeah.
And so you were describing the mountains and wherever it was, whether it was up in Scotland or you were. And I was jealous. I was there with you, and I'm like, oh my god! So I haven't got a camper van, and that would be really cool. And I always thought, because I was a lifeguard and swimming teacher for 10 years, so
cool.
I always thought about swimming the channel, but then dysphoria sort of took over, and I've not been in a swimming pool for about 15 years. But up till then, I was a teacher, and I competed. So, and it was one of those things that was always in the back of my mind, like but and then the other thing is the crafting, but let's take one thing at a time. There's too much. But I mean, tell me about. So I love that you have these personal achievements, or maybe even the section on wool. So it's arranged that you're talking about a material and then how it's used, and you're talking about crafting, and then you're sort of putting some personal experience to that. And the ones, like I say, that resonated and made me jealous with the outdoor ones. So with the wool section, you were talking about getting a van and just going off to Scotland and swimming across lakes and knitting.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. Like, what made you do that? You just wanted to go? It
Basically, yeah. So I'm that wool chapter is sort of it's kind of about feeling like a bit of a fish out of water living in a big city. I'm a bit of a country bumpkin at heart. I didn't grow up in London. I grew up in a town called Bedford, which is kind of just your bog standard kind of market town in England. It's quite a sort of small town, and so when I moved to London for my PhD, I felt very, very overwhelmed, and still do. I'm still here 8-9 years later, but I do feel very overwhelmed. And for me, London is a city of sort of quite conflicted. So there's friends and there's culture and there's energy and excitement, but then it's also very debilitating in terms of it sucks your energy levels out and it sucks your finances out of your pocket. And I've always felt very kind of conflicted about this place that I live in. And so I actually went holiday, a genesis to my channel swimming endeavors. I went on a swimming holiday and in Croatia with some channel swimming friends, and every day we would wake up, it'd be beautiful sunshine, we would kind of walk 100 meters down the beach into the sea every day, and I was just so happy that week. And I realized, like, this is what makes me happy, is place, and having nice things around me and being able to do these things that I love, like swimming. So I was like, right, how can I get that life but in London? And so for me, the answer was buy a camper van.
Yeah.
So that's what I did, at great personal expense, but absolutely no regrets at all. So I bought this little camper van, and had 5 weeks of summer 2 summers ago, just pootling around Scotland, and learning how to knit. So I'd always wanted to learn how to knit. I always thought it was something quite cool. I liked the idea of being able to make my own sort of clothes and hats and all that kind of stuff. Cool. But I'd never really had the chance to. So on this camper van trip, I was like, right, it's just me and the van. I'm just going to learn how to knit. So I bought some needles and wool, and knitted my way around the Scottish Highlands, buying wool from all the different places that I went to, and made this huge blanket at the end of it. Yeah.
It's just so cool, and like I say, as someone that loves the outdoors myself, I could really feel it when you were talking about it, and it was just, I missed that. Yeah, I really strongly missed it. And like you say, I think use that to also sort of learn to knit as well. I mean, that's really cool. So, I mean, was it something you intended before you set out, or was it literally you went past a wool shop and you're like, here's my next 5 weeks?
Good question. I can't remember when I had the idea. I'm pretty sure I had the idea maybe a few weeks before I went, and bear in mind as well, this was the year that I was writing the book. So I was like, I need a book chapter out of this as well. Because so the book is 12 chapters long. 10 of those are materials chapters, so one material every chapter. I had a year to write the book, so that's pretty much one chapter per month. 7,000 words a chapter. Each chapter needs to have an experience going to meet a maker, and needs to have sort of personal anecdotes and stories. It needs to have science and history. Those are kind of all the key beats in every single chapter. But bearing in mind that I was also working a full-time job, meant that it was actually pretty tight going to generate enough content to keep writing every single month a whole new chapter. So I also had to capitalize massively on everything that I was already doing. So the fact that I had this holiday booked in this camper van, I was like, I kind of need to get some content out of this as well for the book. So that was a sort of not very glamorous reason for doing it.
But it's cool. You got that new skill, and it's a lot harder to take a forge in your in your camper van. So I think knitting was probably an easier choice, if I'm honest. And what is interesting, because a lot of the chapters are about making things and with sort of materials, so wood, and you got sort of steels, and you got plastics and wool, which is really cool. And you do have a chapter on sugar as well, and it's interesting because we make food basically, and so you tie it in that way. And that was I don't know, the material was really different from the others, and so it sort of took me by surprise. But also it was the chapter where you talked about your channel swim, and I just never considered tying in the sugar, because it's cooking, it's baking, and that that's a craft like everything else.
I mean, I really enjoyed writing that chapter, partly because the story of it is the story of my channel swim, and that was just such a huge sort of thing in my life. Impressive. Anyway. Also, when I was training, I'd written a training blog, and I'd already written up the swim. So again, cool. Me trying to overlap as many interests as possible with writing the book, I was like, I've already kind of written this chapter. I'm just going to rework it for the book. So that was quite handy. But yeah, sugar is so important in endurance exercise, and in channel swimming particularly. And it's this Ellie, the maker that I talked to, Ellie Doney, she's a food researcher and sort of materials. She's an artist actually, but she's quite sciencey in her approach. Describes sugar as a mega material, which is so true, because it comes in all of these different forms. It can be like a single crystalline grain, or it can be like pink and fluffy in spun sugar, or it can be sort of dissolved in liquids and hidden. So it's this, or like a really gloopy, like viscous treacle. There's so many different sort of shades of sugar. And so but then it also has a very checkered past, you know. Sugar was one of the main substances that fueled the transatlantic slave trade, and it's got this really dark, shameful history to it. And if we're talking about materials, a lot of the substances, like talk about steel, for example, or, you know, the Industrial Revolution, you can't talk about materials without talking about the Industrial Revolution, especially in terms of the sort of British history of materials. And yet all of that was financed by sugar from the slave trade. And so there's these really fascinating links and important links to remember about all these materials. And so I didn't want to shy away from any of that stuff. And hopefully I've done the story justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was in there, and I think you can't hide away. And that's also true when you're talking about other materials, because you were talking about your grandfather as well, and your grandfather during the war and being involved in making planes and things like that. And was it nice to be able to delve into the family history and pull that side out? And it was also, I mean, it fit. It was exactly what your book, you know, it was part of the book, and it made perfect sense to be there. Is it nice to be able to talk about family and have that link?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So this is my plastics chapter.
Yes.
And yeah, my granddad George, my Polish granddad, on my dad's side, he's always been this sort of very big figure in my life. You know, I grew up in the UK. My dad grew up in the UK, but we've all got this Polish surname, and it's a funny thing, because I don't really identify with any sort of Polish culture. I've been there 3 times, maybe 4 times. My dad doesn't speak Polish. My granddad didn't teach any of his kids Polish, so we don't have any kind of cultural links to it, and yet we have this very complicated surname that often requires a lot of explanation. And so my granddad George has been the only link in my life to that side of my kind of identity, I suppose. And so he was always quite mysterious to me. And so the story of the plastics chapter is the story of his life. He was born in 1910 in Russia, and he died when he was 97, so in 2007. So he lived essentially the whole of the 20th century, which was a tumultuous century in many ways, in all sorts of areas, but particularly in terms of the rise and fall of plastics. You know, he was born just a few months after the first ever synthetic plastic Bakelite was invented. And by the time he died, you know, everything in his world had turned to plastic. And these materials sort of intersected with his life story in various times as well. So including when he first moved to England, sort of at the end of the Second World War. After the war, he needed to kind of settle in this country and really make a life for himself, because it wasn't safe to return to Poland. So he started a plastics company, making plastic. He was an engineer, so he's kind of recognized the future of these materials in 1945. And so for me, that was a really fascinating opportunity to be able to tell his life story, which is just the most tumultuous thing. He's been a refugee twice in his life. He lived through both world wars. As a refugee, he had to flee the first time from Russia east to, they ended up in Japan via the Trans-Siberian Railway, and got separated from his family before the age of 10. And then in the Second World War, he ended up fleeing all the way through Europe, and then got on a boat, ended up in Canada, came back to Europe. It's unfathomable to me as a very privileged middle-class girl who grew up in Bedford her whole life, to witness this kind of life so close in the family. So it was really amazing to be able to draw those stories out. And I never really knew a lot of them before I started writing the chapter, actually. So my granddad had written down his sort of memoirs, and all of the family have a copy of it, but I'd never really sat down to properly understand it. And he wasn't someone he was of a generation that would never talk about their feelings or really even anything that had happened to him. So he would always sort of hint at this sort of very a life full of sort of adventure and sort of terrifying occurrences. But I never really properly understood it before I sat down and read about it, and then subsequently wrote about it as well. So that chapter is very much based on his memoir. I sort of the spine of the chapter, I basically just rephrased a lot of his words. So some of his original words are in there, and his turns of phrase, which are sometimes quite endearing. I've kept some of those in. But it was amazing to get to know him properly. And as I say, he's not someone that would ever have spoken about his feelings, but there's some really tantalizing nuggets in there. For example, from the age of 7, he was fleeing on the Trans-Siberian Railway east from Russia because of the Russian Revolution. And there were lots of sort of different nationalities of soldiers posted in these various cities throughout Russia. Lots of British soldiers posted. And he writes in his memoir that the first words of English that he ever learned were the song "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." And that like kind of punched me in the gut when I read that, and I don't know why. For me, it was just so sort of sweet and innocent, and I remember he always spoke with a very strong Polish accent, even though he lived in the UK since 1945. But I remember him describing feeling the first time he ever felt British or felt English was when he switched from dreaming in Polish to dreaming in English. So he's always, I don't know, but then to hear that, his first words that he ever learned were this kind of like very stereotypically 1920s like song. I don't know. It just, it really, really brought a tear to my eye.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting what you're saying about switching the language, the dreaming, because it's something that I hear from trans people a lot as well when they see themselves, when they change how they see themselves in dreams. And it's something that means quite a lot to me. So that's really interesting.
That's really really
it's funny, isn't it? The dreams, it shows a lot about how we look at ourselves and think about ourselves. And also the foresight to be sort of, like you say, right at the start of plastics and really sort of starting a company and trying to get them out. I think it was interesting that you also sort of looked at the lifespan. And of course, you're looking at the modern climate where, the big push is to remove plastics, to get away from that. And I know you touch on it, but, what would he have made of it? What would...
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think so. His job was aircraft designer. He worked as a designer for his whole career, and I think the thing about plastics that I wanted to get across really is that it's so much bigger than just this one material, right? Like the thing about plastics is that they are a very good poster child for the amount that we waste as a society, as a sort of species, really.
Yeah,
because they float in the seas, they're very obvious. And they make a very, very compelling emotional case when we see them choking animals in the sea and things. But of course, we also throw away all of our other materials as well. All the metals, all the ceramics, all of the glass, all of the, yes, some of it is recycled, but not really, like not most of it. And so for me, and I think for Grandad George, it is a design problem. The problem is that we're not designing objects and possessions to be recycled or reused or refurbished, fixed. We've designed them in such a way that they are generally single use, and then they end up in landfill. And so I think his attitude would be definitely that it's a design problem. We need to start redesigning stuff better. That's what I think it makes better.
Sorry, and you're talking about sort of starting a business in the sort of 1940s, and at that time you didn't make things for single use. You made things to last. You made things, and this is, and you were talking about there's lots of level of examples, of course, like clothes. Fast clothes. The turnover we got with clothes, they don't last. People don't darn them. They don't keep them. They wear them twice. And yeah, I guess it was a very different world that when he started that company, it was you design stuff to last, and it was like, well, can plastic last? Which it can.
Exactly.
And so that was a good thing. That was a
Yeah,
strength of the
totally.
material.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's yeah. um so obviously I talked about some of the chapters that I'm sort of trying to keep an eye on the time-ish as well. um, I mean, and there's some chapters where I love it, the wistfulness of the so of being in the mountains, and then you've got
Mm.
the challenge of swimming the channel. And to be honest, I was as shattered as you at the end of that chapter. And it's interesting, you could tell that you'd used notes that you'd written at the time,
Oh,
because
really?
yeah, because it had that sort of like, I've done it and this is amazing,
Mm.
time to sleep
Yeah.
sort of feel
Yeah.
to it. And so you could tell when you said it came from diaries. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Oh, interesting.
But then you've got like the sort of deeply personal stories. You've got
Mm.
your granddad's story, but then also you talk about how it was doing a PhD, and you talk about
Mm.
how difficult that was. And so there's really it's a real journey. It's a real autobiography, and it really is
Amazing.
interesting. And it's interesting how you sort of frame this all around different materials. And I'm
Mm.
a big old crafter. I make dioramas and I make minis and paint and
Yeah.
things like that. So when I'd read it, it was interesting. I was thinking, well, I've got 5 different types of epoxy resin that I use just there for
Great.
casting. And so
Yeah.
I was like, well, maybe I should sort of, do a similar thing, but talking about, specifically from the modeling point of view.
Yeah. 100%.
I think after reading your book, I had sort of sketched out like how I could do a similar sort of book, and
Oh,
I'm like,
good.
no, that's your book. I need my own book. I need my own idea.
I don't own this idea.
Oh, I know.
Do Handmade too.
Yeah. Well, Handmade too. Yeah, the D&D nerds version.
Well, this is the conclusion that I come to in the book, right? Is that this is my story with just 10 materials. There are hundreds of materials that you could tell stories about, that I could tell stories about, but I'm just one person, and those are just my personal stories. We all have these kinds of stories with materials. So I really hope that the book will help people, like you just say, identify the material stories in their lives.
Yeah. I think in terms of the materials that you use in your crafting, because I am a crafter, and so I was jealous at some of the things you've done. I've done some glass melting, but I've never done glass blowing. I think that's the one that made me most jealous. I think glass blowing. Did you have a favorite? I mean, I think it's hard to choose, right? And they're all so different. But was there a favorite activity that you did?
I think for me, the most visceral was blacksmithing.
Yeah.
It was such a rare privilege to be able to go and spend time with a brilliant artist blacksmith called Agnes Jones up in Glasgow. She is just incredible. And to be able to, because also steel is such a huge material in material science. It's like the big one. And so to be able to experience it hands-on, like I say, it's not something that I'd had before. So to be able to really feel the softening of steel when it's heated, to be able to feel it work hardening as I hit it with a hammer, to be able to kind of stretch it round by hand was just incredible. And to feel the heat of it and to see it coming out of the forge kind of white hot, yellow hot, and then cooling down, and the hammer scale flaking off as you hit it with the hammer. It was just, that was amazing. So I think that was probably my favorite single experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think glass blowing is the one that I'd want to do the most, but I also think I'd be a bit rubbish at it, if I'm perfectly honest.
It's hard.
Metalsmithing, I've done a little bit of casting and things like that, and I've made a knife. But I'd love to make like a Damascus steel blade or something.
Yes.
So that is the other material that's like, if someone gave me money and said you can do craft things. This is your Christmas present. Which do you want to do? I think I'd probably go for the steel forging over the glass, just because I think I'd be more likely to have something at the end of it.
Yeah. Spend some time with like some Japanese knife makers.
Yeah, because I've done some bonsai casting, and that was fun, but it's very different. It's not the same. That's amazing. That's amazing. So I guess, I mean, is there anything else in the book that I always ask people this? Is there anything else that we haven't touched on but you'd like to mention, and whether it's something from the book or something outside of that? And that doesn't have to be.
I guess one of the things that I'm a bit... So this is the first book interview I've done, as I said.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm slightly worried about is, like you say, is extremely autobiographical. I don't hold much back.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And I don't know how that's going to be received. I don't think anyone's ever written a book quite in this way before.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people are going to read it and just say, we don't care about your life. We don't care that you're gay. Shut up.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I think I understand that, because you're putting so much of yourself out there, and does anyone care? And yet so many of the talks that I've been invited to do are about my life. I've shared some really personal and intimate stuff. I mean, my TED Talk talks a lot about battles with depression and things like that. And I think it's never going into heavy politics. Your politics come through, but it's not a political book. And of course your struggles are there. But it's not like it's so difficult to read, because you're talking about stuff and it's raw. But it isn't. I mean, sometimes you read people's stories in heavy depression, and that's you can only read so much. I could have carried on reading it. Either I've become totally desensitized, but it has that mix as well, because it has the accomplishments, like say the swimming, and then managing to forge with steel. It's got the triumphs. It's a real mix, and I think that people really are interested in people's stories, from what I've seen.
I hope so. That's what I'm banking on, to be honest.
I do. People relate to stories. This is why we've got so much reality TV. This is why we sort of lap up vlogs and blogs on YouTube. And I think it's a much harder sell if you wrote a book on materials and it was all material science. That's a small crowd. That'd be it'd be a very good book. Of course it would, but it would be there's only certain people that are going to resonate with that. And actually, with what you've done, I think you've got this really interesting life. You've done all these amazing experiences, and also you can sneak in the science. And it's like we were talking about at the beginning. It's like, science is cool. Science has got some really cool stuff.
It is cool. I think it's cool.
Yeah. Have you thought what goes into sugar? Have you thought what goes into making windows?
Exactly. None of the scientific sections in the book are very long. That's the other thing I wanted to do as well, was make sure that even if it's a bit heavy going at times and you're feeling a little bit out of your depth, haven't quite got your head around atomic structures or quantum mechanics even, in a page or two we'll be back to telling stories about sexual harassment in the workplace, and it's all good.
Exactly. Throwing for a curveball, because I'm writing on quantum mechanics, so I'm having to learn about that. But and of course that's and that story in the lab. I mean, I think that's why it's important to know that so often in science we talk about how people don't matter, we're just scientists and that's all it is. Well, no, it's not. You talked about your experiences. That isn't just, you don't just go in, do the science and come home. There's so much more to it than that. And I think
I really want to humanize scientists as well by telling those kinds of stories. And and put the successes in context, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I think that we're in an age where we've lost trust in science, and we see this. We see a lot of people using science for an agenda, whether it's the government, whether it's anti-trans people. We see anti-vaxxers out there and flat earth people. And I think that as much as I'd love to say that it's, people believing in these conspiracy theories, I think that scientists have lost the trust of people as well with that by not describing the science, by making it look like only we can do this and no one else can, by making it look like, we've made it our own thing. And so, of course, people don't trust us. They don't know what we're doing. And so I think it's really important that we start humanizing scientists. I will say that I might have written a line about this, and unfortunately, it didn't make the bridge.
Oh no!
and I did consider fighting back on that, because I think it is really important that it shows that we're not just scientists; that we're people, and there's more to science than that. And I do wonder whether this is a big part of why we've got such a pushback on science at the minute. I could be wrong. It could be completely wrong, but it doesn't help that we're not making science more accessible. And so books like this help with that. And so I hope it is hugely, mass public, successful, because more people will be learning stuff.
I think in the last year, we've heard a lot of rhetoric about the science says this, we have to listen to the science.
Yeah.
Right, when we're making decisions about public health policy, mainly this year.
Yeah.
Actually, the science doesn't have a voice. The only people with voices are scientists.
Yeah.
And the science has been done by people who are flawed and have their own biases and their own agendas. And I think by dehumanizing science, we run such a dangerous risk of taking it as gospel and not questioning it, and not being critical about the information that it is, the conclusions that it's coming to. And I think that can be really dangerous, because if we take the people out of it, we then miss a massive data set, right? To be scientific about it. And those sorts of influences are significant sometimes. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by writing ourselves out of scientific papers and out of the narrative of science. And in extreme examples, if we don't take into account who the scientists are, bad stuff can get published. And that can be really, really damaging for all sorts of people. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that there is good science and there's bad science, and it's done by humans. And to take it in full context of where it's come from.
And that's something that I say is really important, because anyone can quote a paper, but if it's been discredited and not peer reviewed, that just because it's a science paper doesn't mean it's science. It's good science, and especially, like say, when it comes to trans issues, that's exactly what we hear about. It's all the fringe views. And for me, you've got to look at the consensus and look at the bigger world and look at the majority of papers and data. And
totally. And also, sometimes we don't have to do science about stuff.
Yeah. I mean, not me, because that's how I pay the bills. But
sure.
Until YouTube or my crafting takes off, then
Yeah. I guess we don't always have to study certain things in a scientific way.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's interesting, because I was talking about, I read your book, and I was like, oh, well, I'm using all these different materials for my crafting. And then there was a certain point where it's like, what's my hobby? Do I want to go down that route?
Exactly. Don't ruin it with science.
Maybe that's not what I want to be talking about.
I totally agree. Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm like, oh, but I'm curious now. It's that once you've prodded it, it's like, oh, now I want to know how these boxes are different from each other. But anyway.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm gonna sort of let you go there. So Thank you so much. Where, I mean, the book, where's it? It's been published. Is it going to be widely available? Are you going to be shelves in WH Smiths if we're allowed to go in shelves and
Good
WH
point, yeah.
Smiths?
Well, yeah, it's available in all online bookshops. It'll be available in all physical bookshops if those are open. It's out on the 13th of May this year, 2021. And it's available for pre-order now. And I'm recording the audiobook in a few weeks as well.
Oh, wow. So you get to
If
read it
reading's
all.
not your thing, then you need to this voice.
Yeah.
For hours and hours reading my own words.
Wow, that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Are you going to give yourself different voices for all the different people? No.
So I was thinking about that, but then I was worried that some of the accents might be a bit offensive.
It's the trouble, isn't it? You want to do that and characterize things, but then there's a limit, and we've got to be aware of the limit.
Yeah, 100% that. It was quite funny actually when I had to sort of audition to read my own audiobook. And so I read the opening sections. Yeah, it was really fun. So I read the opening few pages. And I was obviously reading it in my voice, and then in the opening section I'm introducing myself on stage at my first ever comedy event, and I say, hello, my name's Anna and I'm a material scientist, and I had to make my voice different from my normal voice, like to do my stage voice. And then that was when I was like, oh god, this book has got too much of me in it.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah,
yeah,
I will be doing some voices, but I will not be going fully.
Yeah,
I think is the thing.
That's a good call. I'm also well aware that I went the only bookseller I could think of, I said WH Smith, and that's, I don't even buy books from there, really.
No, I mean, I don't even know if they exist anymore.
Well, they did, because I buy crafting stuff. I don't know, but and I guess that means it's going to be a little bit difficult for sort of book tours. Are there going to be online book tours and things like that?
Yeah, at the moment I'm getting booked for gigs. They're online, but they're the ones in the summer and in the autumn, they're sort of saying we're probably going to do it in person, but will you be okay to do it online if not? So it's still a little bit up in the air, but I'm hoping that, maybe not right away in May, but before too long, then I'll be able to actually be going out and meeting people, because that's what it's all about, right? Like we said right at the start of this conversation, so much of communication is about looking people in the eye and having those conversations. Well, with a book, you've already got like physical distance from them. So I think it'd be really nice to actually do what we're doing now, talking to people that have read the stories. And
I love going to sort of book tours and stuff as well, when it's my favorite authors, so it's kind of cool. So that's brilliant. And where can people find you to look out for that sort of information?
Oh yeah, so a really good place is social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Anna Ploszajski, just full name. That's Ploszajski.
I will put the links below as well in the YouTube and the podcast, so people can find them.
Perfect. And I've also got a website, which is annaploszajski.com. So I'll be posting lots of updates there. Yeah, but just Google me if you can spell it, and even if you can't spell it, approximate, and Google will probably find me. Handmade is easier to spell.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I saw a tweet about the book release, and it's like, I've already got it, and I wanted to sort of, part of me wanted to say that, and part of me was like, no. bit of dignity girl.
You can boast about it all you want, it all helps.
It's not very often. It's only the second book I've ever got like in advance, so it's a big thing.
Nice.
Yeah
I'm very pleased.
Awesome. Well, with that, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
thanks so much, Clara.
Like I say, I'll put links below, and until next time, bye. Well, there you go. That's Anna. Anna's great, and I can highly recommend the book. I really enjoyed reading it. I realise I'm in a privileged position to have had an advanced copy, and I do know Anna, but I really enjoyed the book, and hopefully that comes across the fact that I can actually remember stuff, which, given that my memories are sieve, is pretty interesting. So, like I say, whether you're on vodcast or whether you're on podcast, I'll be putting links in the description to Anna. So hopefully with podcast you can get that. With YouTube, definitely they'll be down below. And if you can like, subscribe, that'd be wicked. And tell your friends to buy Anna's book. And with that, take care. I'll see you soon, and bye.